Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us in this LinkedIn Live session. We are very excited about discussing the topic of why healthy soil matters to business. We know that food and agriculture is one of the biggest challenges we face when it comes to solving climate change. And we know that building healthier soil is fundamental. Food and agriculture is the number 2 driver of greenhouse gas emissions. Globally, it's the number 1 use of our world's water. 70 to 80% of water goes into agriculture. It's the number 1 driver of deforestation and land use change. We know that food and agriculture sits at the very center of some of the biggest problems we face. It's also on the front lines of many of the challenges. It's feeling the pressures of climate. We're seeing our supply chains already being deeply challenged by droughts and floods and greater volatility in the system. And so we know we have much work to do to prepare ourselves for producing food in the future in a much more volatile environment. But in addition to that, we think I believe truly that food and agriculture holds the promise to solve some of the greatest challenges of climate by improving our soil health and sequestering much more carbon in the soil. My name is Sam Cass. I was the former senior policy advisor for nutrition in the Obama administration. I was also the White House chef. I'm now a partner at Acre Venture Partners, investing in early stage companies trying to solve these challenges. And we have 3 panelists here today to discuss the importance of soil, food and ag, and climate change. 3 of the leading minds and people doing just incredible work around the country and around the world. The first, I'd like to welcome Robert de Verder. I did my best. The head of nutrition, the CMO for nutrition for Unilever, is doing just incredible work, and I'm so excited to hear about all the work that Unilever is doing. Mark Isbell, who's a partner at Isbell Farms, who I've had the pleasure of speaking with Mark in the past. He's really doing some of the most innovative work I've seen to really move our food system forward. So I'm very excited to hear from him. And then Emily Haspela, who leads sustainability for Ardo and has a critical perspective on how we actually transition our supply chain to a far more sustainable future. So we're going to get into this right now. We're going to cover what is actually regenerative agriculture, and there's plenty of debate and discussion and confusion around this topic. We're going to talk about what's working, and very importantly, and I think this is really where it comes down to, is how can we scale and accelerate the transition that we are just beginning. We are going to take questions at the end, so please submit your questions, and we will get to them at the end. Don't ask the tough ones. We like those ones. So let's kick things off. Really excited to get into it. Lots to discuss. So Mark, being on the ground doing the work itself, the hard work. Can you please just give us the basics on what is regenerative agriculture? Help us understand what actually that means on the ground.
You bet, Sam, and I'm glad you're starting with the easy questions this morning here, so we can maybe get better from there. But no, you started talking there. You mentioned some of the issues surrounding agriculture. We have there are greenhouse gases that flow from that. There are resource concerns. You mentioned some statistics about the place that holds in those, but the important statistic that we all need to consider as well is it may be 10% of this, 5% of that, but it's 100% of our food. So if we're going to make a difference in how we impact climate change and how we impact resource concerns, we have to do that by continuing to create the food that our world needs. And farmers across the last 60 years have done an incredible job of that. We're feeding 3 times as many people as we were 60 years ago in the world, twice as many in the U.S., and we're doing it for cheaper as a percentage of income than we were many years ago. And so I think we should celebrate those successes as we start, and then ask ourselves the question, what can we do to do better so that we can not only continue to provide this important resource for the world, but that we can also make a difference for the future. And so if we ask the question, what is regenerative ag? To me, it is something that is additive and not subtractive, or not extractive, rather. We're not taking away and not putting back. So we don't want to take away from the environment in a way that is not going to be good for the future. But we also need to be clear that we don't need to take away from people in our effort to try to address that as well. So completely throughout the supply chain, we have to make sure that we're sharing value, that we're investing and not just extracting from the soil and from the people who make their livelihoods from these activities. And then we also need to consider that it needs to be regionally diverse. What regenerative agriculture looks like in one area, in one particular crop, is not necessarily what it's going to look like elsewhere. The resource concerns may be different, and the benefits that we can provide may be different in those different areas. So we have to have, you wish you could say regenerative ag is, and give a 1 or 2 word statement. You can do that in terms of principle, and I would say it's additive and not extractive. But if we look at specifically what it is in any given location, we have to remember that it's nuanced. So I think if we come away with this, we need to think that regenerative ag is a little more nuanced, particularly, than we might understand. If you want to look to an organization that has put out some definitions and some thought leadership in this, I have the privilege of working with an organization called Field to Market that's made up of 200 organizations across the supply chain. Unilever is a member of that as well, and it's done some great work in terms of laying out what those principles look like.
Great. Thank you for that. Emily, so at Ardo, it would be great to get a sense from your perspective. What does regenerative agriculture mean to you, and tell us some about the work that you're doing with Ardo.
Yeah. Maybe to start also, for those who don't know Ardo is a producer of frozen vegetable, fruits and herbs with production mainly across Europe. We also have a plant in Costa Rica. And so we work together with farmers in contract farming. So we have contracts with them. And we saw quite some years ago already the need to start working more on sustainable agriculture. So that's where in 2011 we started with the launch of a program which is called MIMOSA, Minimum Impact, Maximum Output Sustainable Agriculture. So that was really the first steps we took, and it was about limiting our impact on the environment whilst producing in the most optimal ways the crops, limiting pesticides, using optimally seeds, etc. To do this, achieve this, we really worked on the active field management, and we have a team of 65 agronomists working together and supporting our farmers. But now we see that, especially with the latest climate impacts, we see the need to accelerate as much as possible also these things. And we are relaunching Mimosa with Mimosa Plus, looking at soil health, cover crops, and many other aspects such as irrigation, fertilizers, and others. So really focusing also on actions on the ground that can have a positive, or limiting as much as possible also the impact that we have.
That's great. And Robert, let's turn to you. It'd be great to hear the work that you're doing at Unilever. Unilever's doing some of the most sort of cutting edge, progressive work that I've seen throughout the industry. So please give us a sense, like what does regenerative ag look like at Unilever, and why are you guys so heavily investing in it?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Look, why are we vested in it? First and foremost, as a business, we need to have a resilient supply chain. If harvests fail, there will be no food ingredients to put into our products. With Unilever, we've been in business for almost 100 years. And we realize if we want to be in business for another 100 years, we have to start to invest in protecting our soil. And regenerative agriculture is going to be the way, the agricultural practice, to actually be able to grow the food ingredients we need whilst restoring that soil. We have 10 projects live today, and we have a roadmap of more than 100 projects across the globe, which we want to have implemented by 2030. And this will contribute to our commitment to restore and regenerate up to 1.5 million hectares of land, oceans, and forests by 2030. And the ingredients that come from this land will go into our nutrition products, focusing on our two biggest global brands, Knorr and Hellmann's. And last but not least, regenerative agriculture is the key lever for us with Unilever Nutrition to reach our net zero targets by 2039. So a very important role for Regen Ag, and we're very much looking forward to scale that and bring that across.
Great. All right, let's switch to getting a little more granular about some of the actions that are happening and why, from a business standpoint, regenerative agriculture is so important. Before I do, though, I just want to remind everybody, please put your questions in the chat, and we will get to them in a few minutes. So maybe, Emily, we start with you. Like, as a supplier, what does the transition really look like? Where are you investing? Why are you investing there? And what's starting to happen on the ground?
Yeah, it was already mentioned, but the main motivation actually to really invest in regenerative agriculture is definitely resilience to climate change. So that's the main motivators. To be very concrete, we saw, as Mark was saying also, we saw a real increase in the yields of the crops we grow. So peas, for example, we went from the 60s, from 3.5 tons per hectare to 7.5 by 2015. But the last 5 years, we've really seen a dramatic shift. We see a loss of yields in our fields of about 20% across Europe, across all our crops. So we see a dramatic impact already the last 5 years. So it's becoming very real. And it's only the start, unfortunately. So we are at 1.2, 1.3 degrees increase in climate, in temperature. And this is only the beginning of it. So we really need to increase this resilience to climate change, and it all starts with the soil. So the structure of the soil, the nutrient content of the soil is really the best way to, our best ally to combat climate impacts. We see this. I don't want to get into too much details, but for example, the structure of the soil, a good structured soil can bring the nutrients and also give the access to the plants, to the water that is stored in the soil, and improve the resilience to droughts or even floods.
Right. Wow, that's pretty dramatic impact you're already seeing. It's stunning. We think about this as something in the future, but it's playing out right now in ways that I don't think everybody really realizes. Mark, give us the grower perspective, because I do think constantly we don't put the grower at the heart and center of all these conversations. So, as a producer, why is this so critical for farmers? And please give us a little more, insight about what you actually have accomplished on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. So, on our family farm, I'm a fourth generation farmer, and we've been implementing conservation and sustainable practices for my entire lifetime. We grow primarily, almost exclusively, rice on our farm. And it's an important crop for our state. It's about 50% of the rice grown in the U.S. is grown in Arkansas. It's an important crop to our economy in our state. If you look across the world, rice makes up about 11% of the coverage of arable land, and 20% of the calories consumed in the world come from rice. So this is a critical crop. We have to have it. We have to grow it. We have to make sure that we do it sustainably. One of the issues surrounding rice is that there are methane emissions that are related to that, and that comes because healthy soil, as Emily was talking about, is teeming with life. It's full of microorganisms. They say in a teaspoon or a tablespoon of soil, there's more microorganisms than there are people in the world. Some of those are methanogenic, right? So if they're covered in water, they're going to create methane as they decompose anaerobically the organic matter. But if you allow the soil to dry for different times throughout the season, you can stop that process. And what has been shown through research on our farm, this isn't aspirational, this isn't anecdotal, this is peer-reviewed, published research. We can diminish methane emissions by over 63% implementing this practice. And so that's been adopted more widely. We're seeing a lot more interest in that, and it's really making a difference in that. Bonus, we also get water savings from that. So it's a win-win. It's something that does have risk involved, which is why we have to have partners like Unilever to help make that transition and to continue the support of that into the future so that we can always work together to continue to solve this problem.
It's amazing, though. That is a dramatic reduction. And if we could find solutions like that and scale them across the board, we'd be a long way towards our vision for the future. Robert, it'd be great to reflect on some of the, with a little greater detail on the projects and the work and progress you've been making at Unilever and some of the results you're seeing.
Sure. So I'm happy to do so. Look, from the current projects live, although early days, we're seeing some very promising results. Mark spoke about rice. We've got a rice project going on in Arkansas in the US, where we're working with a supplier called Riviana, and we're measuring up to 48% less greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram rice produced in 2022 compared to when before we had this project. And that's coming from a simple technique, but very clever, called alternate wetting and drying, which uses less water than the traditional methodology of producing rice. And that then leads to significantly less methane emissions. But also, for instance, we have a project in Spain with a supplier called Agras, where we grow our tomatoes. And we're already measuring 37% less greenhouse gas emissions, simply because we're using less energy for irrigation and less fertilizer. And in addition, increasing soil organic matter on all the participating farms. And like I said in the beginning, we are already seeing that it's strengthening our resilience. In 2022, Europe faced a significant drought and heat, and crops were down roughly 40% of tomatoes. However, because of the regen practices we had with Agras, we were actually able to source all our tomato supply in Europe for our soups and our sauces. And we know that our competitors were struggling. So this underlies the business benefit already materializing for us today. Very tangible.
That's incredible on both sides, right? In terms of lessening the impact, but also preparing ourselves for the future. It's, we're starting to get some scale to the evidence of how powerful these interventions and transitions are. And
absolutely.
So it leads us to the next section around really what comes next. And I think in the end, the most important question becomes, how do we fundamentally start to scale these solutions? Because while these smaller projects are how one has to start, getting this to scale is critical. So, Mark, from a grower perspective, what is the kind of interventions and support systems, incentives that growers are going to need to transition from more conventional practices to more regenerative ones? And what are some of the barriers that you have experienced or people in your community have experienced as they've started to make this transition, both in terms of the actual practices, but maybe also the surrounding culture that enables a grower or is a barrier to that kind of change?
Right. So I think if we look to the Unilever, Riviana, and farmer partnership, it's a good example of some of the things we can do right. One, you've got support, some financial incentives associated with this change in practice, but you also have technical support with working with the university and researchers to help implement this. So that's critical to have those people there to help explain things and help measure things if we're trying to figure out exactly what the impact is. And the savings that we've been able to get from that adds value to the entire supply chain. And so what's also critical as we build this is we make sure that value that is created, not just the environmental value, which will accrue to the entire population of the world, but the economic value, which is going to be generated to the supply chain, is shared back down through that supply chain and financial incentives to farmers. If we can make that happen in an appropriate way, then we'll be able to drive adoption with other farmers around us. So, as you mentioned, cultural issues surrounding adoption, people like to do things the way they've always done them. But with the appropriate incentives and with the clarity that there can be success from those activities, then you will see adoption.
Great. So can we go to Robert?
Sure.
Where is? Sorry. You say so? No, okay. Actually, maybe Emily, do you have any comments on how you're bringing? And then Robert, then I'll come to you in a couple of specific points to you on that. And sorry, the sun has come up in Washington D.C., so it's got the bright lights on me. Emily, talk to me about the effort to start really scaling this. Are there barriers that you guys have run up against, and are there some solutions, or what does scale mean to you in this context?
Yeah, well, it's a bit like what Robert is saying also. We did some really nice projects so far, and now it's really our ambition to scale, and we need to scale this as quickly as possible. And I agree with what Mark is also saying, that for us, our role in that, and we do this also jointly actually with Unilever, is bringing both the technical support and the financial incentives. So to, for example, finance cover crops or different actions on the ground that can really accelerate. And a big part of that is also communicate, make people aware, farmers aware, cross breeds actually the good ideas, the best practices. So, for example, we organized also a big event in September in our headquarters with more than 1,000 people, where we invited with really demonstrations on the fields, on soil health, on biodiversity, on irrigation, on cover crops, etc. To really create this awareness, because we have amazing examples of farmers like Mark who have taken the lead on regenerative agriculture, but then it's creating awareness and then bringing the technical support, which we do through our team of agronomists, which we are reinforcing, and also thanks to the help of Unilever as well.
I do think something that people forget is there's the practice changes and the actual on the ground more technical stuff, but there's also a cultural shift that has to happen throughout the entire supply chain, including on the ground from growers, because there's a way of doing it that is set in terms of, and it becomes an identity, right? And we have to start to switch our identity in terms of how we're actually growing the practices we use to grow these key ingredients. Okay, Robert, it'd be great to get. I have two parts for you. One, what does scale look like? What comes next for Unilever? You've obviously seen some very powerful proof points. How do you think about scale? And then, as the CMO, talk to us a little bit about where the consumer sits in this, because I do, right now where there's younger consumers definitely care a lot about this. The mass market has yet to show the larger companies that there's a lot of pull happening towards things like regenerative or low carbon. That's coming, I think, but how do you bridge the gap, and what is needed to unlock consumer demand here, and how important is that?
Yeah, sure, Sam. So on the scale bit, the end goal will be that all the produce we need comes from regeneratively farmed produce. We've got 10 projects live now. We've got 100 in the funnel. And we hope that this becomes more and more the norm, so that others where our size is a little bit smaller will also take the lead on those, and we can start to source that. Regarding creating the demand, in all honesty, we can't wait for consumer demand before we start to scale Regen Ag. The majority of consumers today, they're not aware of what regenerative agriculture is and why it matters. For the mass, it's far away from their daily lives and needs. Now, we will use compelling claims where we can, but probably without going into too much detail of what it means technically. But maybe to give an example, in the US, where we have some Knorr products that contain rice, we're making the claim now, because that rice is regeneratively grown in America, we say grown by American farmers, protecting American soil. Now, that is a claim that doesn't give a lot of technical background, but it surely resonates with our American consumers. And with that, we try to generate that demand and reward the farmer for that job that they're doing. But I think the real thing that will help us to accelerate demand and supply is that we work together as an industry with governments and NGOs to educate on the importance and the value of regenerative agriculture, and to make it eventually stand out and get more breadth on shelves. And meanwhile, we need leaders like Ardo, Riviana, Agras, farmers like the ones that Mark represents that actually do the implementation on the ground, and companies like Unilever to continue the lead and to drive this to get that more resilient supply chain and to be able to be in business to have food 100 years from now.
Yeah, I love that so much. I think it's really that's leadership, and right now we're sort of out of time to kind of wait for everybody else to play their part. Everybody has to take responsibility for their role in this, and I agree. Like if we wait for it to become the thing that everybody is demanding, it's going to be too late. So I very much appreciate that perspective. Maybe we just do a quick round robin on sort of final thoughts or key call to action, and then we're going to get into our questions. So maybe Emily, you want to kick that off? Final thought.
Yeah, I think that it's really about the fact that the soil is really our best ally to get more resilient food systems and resilient from. It's a double positive impact in the sense that on the one hand we limit the impact that our food production has on the environment, and at the same time we actually are able to grow our crops and have food to feed the global population.
I'm with you. How about Mark, to you next?
Yeah, certainly. A couple generations ago, there were thoughts that at some point we'd be running out of food by now. And farmers answered the call. We figured out, working along with scientists, how to do better, how to create more food. And that wasn't without its externalities that we're now addressing. We're now faced with another challenge. We're told that, we're definitely seeing increasing temperatures. We're having issues surrounding climate change, and farmers are again being asked, how can we address this? We're going to keep addressing the issues that we had as far as creating enough food for the world. And now we're going to do our part in addressing the issues of climate change. But it's going to take a partnership. It's going to require that the entire supply chain works in processes like we're seeing with this Unilever project to make sure that there's shared value and there's shared rewards, and that in the end we all benefit from these projects.
Amazing. All right, Robert, last word on this part to you. Final
Which
thought.
one, Sam? Sorry, can you repeat?
Just a final thought, kind of call to action.
Well, I think my call to action would be, as a food system, we need to come together. I think you need to realize that the farmer is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and they require education, access to technology, and they need to understand how the financing works, right? And that's where we as businesses and suppliers need to come together to enable that, because otherwise they would have done it. So it is understanding what are some of the new methodologies, like the rice example we shared. Yep. And then it needs some longer term commitments from suppliers, manufacturers like ourselves, that say this is what we want to stand for. And there are projects that don't fly from day one. If you stop using fertilizer, you will see the yield go down first, yeah? And you need to be able to see through that and then to navigate. So I just want to call out, this is not easy, and this will not go automatically. We need to work together within the food system to make this happen. And I'm sure that we will then be able to reap the benefits, yeah? And inviting everybody to join the party, if you allow me to call it like that.
I think hopefully it is a party as we successfully transition these supply chains. Thank you guys for your comments here. I think what we're seeing on the screen are the components of what the change really looks like. I do think, Robert, to your point, it does call for new ways of working, collaborations that have been sort of unnatural in the system, understanding and transparency, ability to reach back into the supply chain in a way that companies just aren't used to doing, and kind of reworking how the system is really structured and set up and incentivized. And so I think we're seeing it starting to work, and now the push is bringing it to scale, and we're starting to see that work. So thank you guys so much for all that you're doing and for your comments. I think is deeply insightful. The questions are pouring in. There's unlikely we're going to get to even a fraction of them. But I'm just going to run through what I have, and let's see what we can do in the next 15 minutes. The first question, Robert, this one's probably good for you. How is Unilever incentivizing and supporting the grower transition? So what can you tell us about the relationship and the supports that you're giving growers to make these changes to their practices?
Sure. No, I think it comes down to those 2-3 things that I just mentioned. So the farmer needs to understand what are we asking, them to do differently. So what is the technique that we're bringing to the table, and how do you make that they are actually able to implement that in the field on their land? We need to help them with the measurement, because if we can't measure it, it's probably going to dry up from funding and from demand quite quickly. And we need to find financing to make that transition realizable. And the reality is it's not going to come from consumers alone, because like I said earlier, this is still very far away from them. And many, let's say, they are not feeling the pain yet of what could happen to us if we don't embrace this 30, 40 years from now, when there is no more, healthy soil to grow the crops on. So it's that financing, it's those techniques, and it's really making it happen on the ground, and then getting the measurable outputs and steering through that. I think those are the big things. And a company like Unilever can't do that without suppliers like Ardo, Riviana that I mentioned, that are able to reach those farmers, connect to those, aggregate that demand, and then get that back into our food system. So I think the interdependency is what people really need to realize, and the fact that we need to all lean in and do our bit, and that this is a longer term kind of game. No quick win, although the example from Agras in Spain does show that the return can come quite quickly for you. Yeah.
And I throw this open to anybody who wants to take it, because I think everybody would have a slightly different perspective on this next question. What can smaller businesses do who don't have, sort of the bigger budgets, do to participate in this transition? Do you have thoughts on that?
But I think it might depend also where in the supply chain, in the food supply chain, they are located. So how close they are to farmers, etc., or further down the line. But everybody has its role to play. Whether it's governments, whether it's universities, education, everybody, farmers, companies like Unilever, companies like us, we all have a role to play to support actually this much needed transition. So even as a smaller company, you can take up your responsibilities and do what you can, maybe at a smaller scale, but still have a very positive effect.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Just deciding you're going to try to figure out what is possible, learning about what these transitions look like, and taking any step forward right now is better than nothing, even if you can't do the whole lot of it. Getting going is sometimes the hardest part.
Hey, Sam, can I build to that? I think also looking into strange looking partnerships, maybe. Yeah. So we have a project in the US where we're partnering with PepsiCo, and you could say, hey, that's interesting, because PepsiCo is also, a competitor of ours. But we realized actually that where they grow and they have a need for corn, and we have a need for soy, actually soy can serve as a great cover crop for farmers that are growing corn, right? Because if you constantly grow the same crop on the land, you start to deplete the land. So you need to grow different kind of crops in order to give back to the land. And that combination of corn and soy is actually quite good. So we both have a similar need in driving regenerative agricultural practices. And actually by combining the demand together, we're able to get the traction and to offer those farmers a demand for not only the primary crop, but also the cover crop. So it's these kind of things where I would invite, players in the food system to actively lean in and to find out who would be a logical partner for me. Yeah. Because that way you will go a lot faster. If you want to do it alone, we're never going to get there. We need to work together to realize this.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it's a wonderful model, a wonderful example of the kind of new kinds of partnerships that have to be forged in a way that we just would never have thought about doing that before, right? But without it, it's just not gonna work. Nobody can do this on their own. And I think that's what's really different about this moment. And we're going to just have to understand where we sit and how we relate to, partners on either side of us in a way that we just haven't before. Mark, question for you. From a farmer's perspective, how do you think we can best diversify rotations, or which of course rotational growing for many growers obviously is somewhat crop specific, but is a core principle. But do this in a way that maintains farmer income. So what do you think has to happen as people make these sort of practice changes, add more rotations to their approaches, but do in a way that at the very least doesn't hurt income, but hopefully actually increases it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with an understanding of what works in what region. Robert mentioned cover crops. Cover crops are great if your main resource concern is water quality and erosion. However, in the Mid-South where we grow rice, we don't really have an issue with erosion. So we have very flat fields, and we're able to catch the water. But in the winter, rather than cover crops, what we're able to do is flood those fields and provide habitat for migratory waterfowl. So our rotation over the winter is into a habitat that is creating incredible amounts of, food and resources and shelter for ducks and geese. And so I think there are probably very similar stories across agriculture, right? What we think of as a rotation may look different. And I think that's the place we have to start in considering how we can increase those opportunities.
Just out of curiosity, Mark, does that improve the health of the soil by having those animals sort of live there for a few months out of the year?
I'm not entirely sure what research has been done on that, but I can tell you, if you look at our farm, which doesn't engage in actually the type of typical rotation that you would think of in other areas, we've seen soil organic matter go up from the state average is 1.5% probably. The fields that we've been farming for well over my lifetime are 6+%. So wow. That happens with a combination of no-till. That happens with a combination of growing high biomass crops like rice. And that's not the story you would think you would normally hear if you say you're not rotating. But it comes from knowing that that's what that works in that soil, in that spot. And the same is going to be true elsewhere. There are farmers that have different opportunities on their farms, and we have to be open-minded enough to realize this is a ecosystem complete approach. This isn't taking one solution and applying it all over the world. This is determining what works in one location and building on that. And that's a lot harder than saying, hey, there's one solution, everybody do it. That's why it takes the technical support. That's why it takes the investment. That's why it takes money from, not just non-state actors, but governments as well that need to invest in these types of practices, and they are. And there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration there. We have to take that nuanced approach and realize that these rotations can look a lot of different ways.
Yeah. Maybe adding to that also, like for us, peas is one of a major crop that we are growing. And peas being a leguminous, it's a very beneficial crop to have in the rotation as it's adding nitrogen. So it fixates nitrogen in the soil, which then, on the other hand, enables us to reduce the use of fertilizers. So, depending on your needs and where you are located, it can indeed look very different.
Well, that's actually a great segue into the next question. So maybe we just expand on that a little bit. On the one hand, the question that reads, as the one hand, global agriculture faces the problem of over-applying of nitrogen, and nitrous oxide obviously is a huge driver of the overall footprint of the food system. On the other hand, we need to feed a growing population. Estimates put it at close to 10 billion by 2050. And I just want to remind everybody, we're getting old, people. Like 2050 is not that far away. So it always sounds like a far off number. Like that's actually not that far away. And so how do you guys think about the tension between, yield essentially and producing more calories, which has been largely driven by our ability to produce, cheap fertilizers versus the need to reduce, our application of these fertilizers for an environmental benefit?
Sure. Look, Sam, I'm happy to kick that one off. I think first, to give a bit of an opportunity, a third of the food the world produces today gets wasted. It gets thrown away because it doesn't, get out of the farm in time to, to either the market or the producer that turns it into a sauce or a soup. So that's the first massive opportunity. So we don't need to only grow more food. We also need to make sure that the food that is grown gets to the consumer and gets good to good use and not gets wasted. I think the other part is we need to realize that we need to look more at the diversity of the food that we eat and the food and the meals that we provide. Because if you are able to change the kind of crops you grow on the land, you're able to better balance, for instance, that nitrogen need. Yeah. So there are crops that actually feed that back to the soil. Yeah. But if we only want to eat rice and wheat, which we are over consuming at this point of time, we don't have the ability to actually grow enough cover crops or to create demand for it. And if the cover crop is only grown for the soil, it's probably going to be too expensive for the farmer to really have a competitive business out of that. So we need to make sure that we eat the food we produce, not waste it. And we need to get to a more diverse kind of diet so that we have the ability to actually make sure that we have a rotation on the fields, which will help to restore that soil. I think those are two important aspects to the question you're putting forward.
But maybe just, Robert, on the cover crops, we have seen that actually we can make business cases on putting cover crops that bring the needed nutrients.
Yes.
And that have a positive payback for the farmer, because you reduce the need for chemical inputs the year after. So even if you have a cost for your cover crops, and it's not being used as food, you can still have a very positive business case from a financial perspective. And that's one thing, and I completely agree with what you say on food waste. But we also see, and at least in our regions, in our growing regions, mainly in Western Europe, there is still an overutilization of fertilizers. They are being applied not always for many different reasons, based on the way they were applied for many years. But you can reduce the use of fertilizer and still maintain your yields. Bringing it to zero will be a challenge, but you can definitely reduce already a big part of it.
Fully agree.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, Sam, one of the things that Robert mentioned earlier when he was talking about the RISE project was he was measuring it in terms of not emissions per acre or emissions per land unit, but by kilogram of rice, right? So rethinking the carbon intensity of these different things is important, because if we can maintain yields while reducing inputs, then that's fantastic to the carbon intensity of that crop. But if we reduce yields by reducing inputs and those numbers don't line up, then we're actually making it necessary to use more land to create the same amount of food. Data insights are critical in helping farmers make those decisions, and being able to take the information that's required to prove these practices and process it through different techniques and give insights to those farmers is incredibly important to drive that adoption.
Couldn't agree more. I have there's 7 more questions. I actually have 10 more myself. But I sadly we have come up on time. I just want to say thank you to you three for your insights and your comments, but really more importantly for your leadership and your work on this. I think these are the kinds of efforts that we need at greater pace and scale. I think the one thing that we have to remind ourselves is we're out of time, and that we have to get out of our comfort zones in the ways we've normally done it if we want to actually meet the moment. We have given up the kind of take a little pilot, try it out, test it, learn, see what works. We've lost that chance. What the science is telling us is that this has to scale. These changes have to scale, and they have to scale right now. And it means fundamentally taking on more risks than we're used to doing. And so I think what we've seen here today is that there's enough evidence to show if you invest the right resources with the right determination, that the results are going to come. and that now is the moment where we have to push to take these changes at a scale that, you know, we've not seen move at a pace like that before. And that's the moment. So thank you guys so much for joining us. Everybody who watched, thank you for joining us out there. Thank you for your leadership, and look forward to working with everybody in the months and years to come. Thank you all.